Okay, good afternoon. I'm Assistant Sheriff Brett Zimmerman, and I'm here to brief you on additional details as we know them today about the officer-involved shooting that occurred on Wednesday, February 3rd, 2021. This is OIS number 1 for 2021, fatal number 1, and at the same time last year, we were at OIS number 2, and 0 of those were fatal at that time. The date, time, and type of call was February 3rd, 2021 at 11:59 a.m., and it was an attempt grand larceny. The location of the OIS was the 5900 block of Dean Martin Drive, Las Vegas, Nevada, 89118, which is in the Spring Valley Area Command, and you can see the scene of the map to my left. Our involved officer is Officer Andrew Wynn, and I'll spell that. It's N-G-U-Y-E-N, pronounced Wynn. He is 34 years old and has been with LVMPD since 2018. In this incident, Officer Wynn was armed with a Glock Model 45 9mm handgun equipped with a tactical light. The investigation revealed he fired 9 rounds during the incident. Our suspect is a Marvon Payton Jr., spelling is up there. He's a 27-year-old black male adult, 5 feet 11 tall, and weighs 170 pounds. His criminal history. Mr. Payton does have a criminal history of being violent with police officers, which include the following charges: attempt murder in North Las Vegas PD, battery on a protected person, North Las Vegas PD, attempt robbery of a firearm, North Las Vegas PD, and assault on a protected person, and all of those incidents were violence against the police. Our suspect's weapon, he was armed with a screwdriver. Mr. Payton's charges, had he survived the incident, was attempt murder on a protected person, attempt grand larceny of a firearm, and resisting a public officer with deadly weapon. Details of the OIS. On Wednesday, February 3rd, 2021, at approximately 11:59 a.m., the LVMPD Dispatch Center received an attempted grand larceny call at a gun range located at the 5900 block of Dean Martin Drive. The person reporting stated that a black male adult, later identified as Marvon Payton, had tried to steal a gun that was inside a customer's bag. The caller stated the employees would be standing by with Mr. Payton outside upon the officer's arrival. At approximately 12:27 p.m., dispatch was called again and advised that Mr. Payton was now becoming aggressive and had threatened the employees. Officer Wynn and his partner arrived in the parking lot of the business approximately 12:47 p.m. and attempted to contact Mr. Payton. Officer Wynn and his partner instructed Mr. Payton to stand in front of their patrol vehicle. Mr. Payton ignored those instructions and started to walk away while hiding his right hand in his jacket pocket. Officers attempted to grab Mr. Payton, but he pulled away and still refused to listen to the officers. Officers attempted to grab Mr. Payton by his arms once again to gain control of him. This time, Mr. Payton pulled away and produced a screwdriver from his pocket and violently attacked the officers. Mr. Payton made several overhand strikes with the screwdriver towards one of the officer's head and neck area. Mr. Payton was able to stab one officer during his violent attack. As the injured officer fell to the ground, Officer Wynn and 3 employees of the business discharged their firearms, striking Mr. Payton. Officers immediately summoned medical personnel, but Mr. Payton succumbed to his injuries at the scene. Through the course of the investigation, it was learned that Mr. Payton went into the gun range and walked around the main lobby, then proceeded to the Concealed Carry Weapons Classroom, CCW. The students were taking a break in the classroom when Mr. Payton entered the room and began rifling through a bag which contained a handgun that belonged to one of the students. The owner of the bag was able to prevent the gun from being stolen, and Mr. Payton was escorted out of the classroom at that time. An employee spoke to Mr. Payton for several minutes trying to figure out what he was doing in the gun range. A short time later, another employee called police to report the attempted grand larceny. 3 employees escorted Mr. Payton outside of the business and waited for officers to arrive. At this time, I will now show you the surveillance video from the officer-involved shooting. This first video is actually from the classroom, and Mr. Payton is sitting, he's right here, wearing the black and yellow jacket, and a bag is underneath of one of the students. And again, they were on break at that time, so everybody was coming back into the classroom from the class break. And then this here is the actual surveillance video from the business, in which shows the officer's arrival and the actual OIS. And he's standing down here at the lower portion of the screen. Okay, if there are any questions? Yes, sir.
Just to get the timing correct, the original call was 11:59, and then there was a secondary call half an hour later at 12:27, and then police were 20 minutes after that at 12:47?
Correct. So basically, the way our calls work is, the original call was he was in the business in that timeline, creating whatever disturbance he was creating. I don't think all the information was gathered at first that he'd gone through someone's bag in the classroom. And then we prioritized the calls in regards to a violent type of call where up until our arrival, the individual was not violent. He was outside with those employees. They were kind of standing there waiting for the police to arrive. Of course, I don't know. We didn't get that depth into an interview with them. Don't know if he knew the police were coming. But they were outside waiting on us, the employees, and like I said, with our call priority stuff, we usually go on a violent type call first if one's created, but something like that where the suspect seems cooperative, the business isn't saying he's becoming agitated, and at some point during that time frame, they said he was getting more aggressive, and that's when the units went en route over there. Yes, sir.
Can you speak on the work of those three employees and kind of the uniqueness here of this happening at a gun range? And clearly these three employees likely knew guns very well and ended up getting involved in this. Can you just kind of speak on their involvement in all of this?
Yeah, it seems that obviously when you go into a gun range or a gun store, most of their employees are trained to the T. They're armed usually, and they either instruct firearm classes there or they protect the gun store. All I can say here is we do our own internal investigation on our employees first, and then from what I'm judging or what everybody saw in the video, their training and tactics were kind of along the line of our officer. They saw the same threat. Our officer fired. They fired at about the same time at the threat, saw exactly what occurred, just like you all did with the violent strikes to the officer's face, with what originally was unknown if it was a knife. It had come out that it was a knife. It had turned out to be a screwdriver, but they saw the same thing our officer saw in regards to the threat and an officer either being injured or killed by that individual.
And with those people being involved, was it determined if it was the officer's gunfire that killed the suspect, or was it kind of a culmination of it?
It was a I would have to, the coroner usually makes that call, but the suspect was struck numerous times, so usually you can't make that determination, but I would say, I don't know which bullet killed him, but he was struck numerous times. So I guess later on what'll happen after our case is done, it'll go to the DA's office for our own internal case. The DA then takes a look at that case involving the civilians, which again, looking at the video, they saw the same thing our officer saw.
How many rounds hit Mr. Payton?
There was approximately, they removed 14 rounds from him.
And how many rounds did Officer Wynn
Officer Wynn fired 9 rounds, I believe.
Okay. And were the officers equipped with body cameras, and were those on at the time of the shooting?
The officers were equipped with cameras. They were not on, and it was usually due to the fact they are trained to activate their cameras, but as they pull up to the business, this individual's right outside there, didn't have time to turn the camera on, and you see how quick the incident occurred, where the second they got out of the car, he started pulling away, walking away within, I'd say, 15 to 30 seconds. So under that circumstance, the cameras were not on, and that's something we look at internally from our investigation as to why they weren't turned on immediately.
Is that something that could result in discipline to officers?
Usually in regards to not turning your camera on, the initial time they do it, we do something, we treat it as it's performance related. And in regards to these officers who are on scene, they have we look at everything. They had a very high body worn camera activation rate in the upper 90s percentile of turning their cameras on. So there were no prior issues with these officers. Now, I'm not saying it's not going to result in a performance-related, counseling type thing, but we've had no instances of them not turning their cameras on in the past.
Okay. And who's the officer who was stabbed?
It was one of our officers. We don't release that information in regards to the victim officer on the call. We only release the shooter's information on these calls.
Can you tell us the condition of that officer?
Yeah, she is actually recovering. She's doing better. She had injuries to her head and she had a fractured orbital area around the eye from being struck, but she is actually on the path to recovery, and they were not anything serious. They were serious, but not life-threatening, and she's recovering. Yes, sir.
Can you speak on the dangers of, the work, 1 second you're responding to kind of a mild call for a robbery, but then in a split second it turns into that life-threatening situation?
We're pretty good at our tactics and training, and we teach everybody, no matter what time you have on this agency, that a call can go from, like you said, routine to critical within seconds. This is another type of call that officers could get complacent. They probably handle 10 to 15 type calls of this a week, where there's a subject outside of a business refusing to leave, could be homeless, could be mentally ill, and 99 out of 100 times they're compliant, but it's the one time that they're not compliant that something like this occurs and it turns deadly. But we train from the start to never be complacent and to always be tactically sound. And you saw from this video in what they did, both officers exited the vehicle, looked like they were giving commands to the individual. He starts walking away. One goes around, as you see from the video, to try and box him in to get back to the front of the car. And then from that point, once it starts pulling away enough, hands-on, they had to go hands-on, the type of call. He's armed with something, originally a knife, and obviously tried to steal a weapon while inside the business. Yes, sir.
Just 2 questions, if I could. One, have you had a situation where this many citizens have been involved in a police shooting like this?
I'm just going off my own personal knowledge and my time on this agency. I can't remember a time when a citizen actually fired a weapon along with one of our officers on the scene. I don't know, like I said, I don't have the history of it earlier in my career, but since I've been on staff, 6 to 10 years, I don't remember an incident where we had this many civilians also fire that were actually armed through their type of business that they were, employed at.
We talk a lot about de-escalation, about mental illness. When you approach a scene like that, are officers trained on de-escalation tactics? And did something escalate here, or was this kind of...
We train on de-escalation. Each of our officers takes a CIT class, which is a required 40-hour class. It's basically a crisis intervention class. They're recertified on the crisis intervention. It means that they go through this class to actually deal with those type of situations, to deal with mentally ill persons, and they receive training above and beyond just most of the verbal stuff you utilize with normal citizens or suspects to get them to comply, but they're taught in a manner that they may be dealing with someone in distress, somebody that's mentally ill. So all of our officers receive this CIT training. But like I said, under this circumstance, it's obvious the guy had something wrong possibly mentally, and then for it to happen that quick. And I mentioned earlier his prior violence with police officers. You know, he just in an instant wound up, you know, attacking the officers seconds into that encounter.
Did the citizens arguably save that officer's life? If they were, obviously you had an officer there that's well-trained. What role did they play in what?
I would say our officer, along with the citizens saved, you know, yes, I would say could save that officer's life. Also, the other officer was in danger. Wynn, who also fired, he was that close because you didn't know if that suspect was then going to turn on him. But yes, you know, their involvement actually helped our officer and could have saved our officer's life. Yes, sir.
So what the citizens did, there's no legal question there. They're not facing charges in any kind.
What we do is we submit the case on our officer to the district attorney on any one of our OISs where it's obviously a fatal shooting. After the DA makes determination on that with our officer, we've already spoken to the DA. They will then look at that case in regards to any charges against the civilians. But, you know, like I said, in viewing this video here, it's kind of obvious as to why the civilians fired, and also, you know, civilians too are not as tactically trained as our officers. But they're seeing the same threat that our officer saw there. And for what you saw the initial part of this video, the violent attacks, and they don't know what the injury to our officer was at that time. She actually fell on the ground. So, you know, was she injured? You know, was she more critically injured, or, you know, they don't know what this suspect's going to do next. Is he going to come back for another round of stabbing? But that's how it works. The DA will take a look at that and will decide whether to prosecute the citizens criminally. Yes, sir.
Do you think the protocols for the public and assisting Metro, obviously, public assisting Metro, we don't want to involve a fatal shooting, but
Right.
where is that line?
We always, if on a call like that, we're usually pushing, when we have enough time, we're pushing civilians back. We don't want civilians to get involved when we respond on a call. Our dispatchers are trained to tell the civilian if there's a gun in their house to put the gun away, all these protocols that our dispatchers go through originally, and the officers will ask them while en route to the call to make sure that that's been asked if the dispatcher hasn't asked it. The other part of that too is that when you're dealing with incidents like this with civilians, you could see initially they were off to the side. It didn't seem like they wanted to get involved, but when they saw what occurred, that's when they took action. But we want people to be as good of witnesses as they can. Now, under circumstances where an officer's out there by themselves and an officer's in a knockdown, drag-out fight with a suspect in the street, we've had citizens come to our aid and assist us under those circumstances. But it's only under those extreme circumstances, and that's what we preach.
Last question.
Yes, sir.
Would your officers have had any knowledge of Mr. Payton's violent history with police as they were responding to that call? In other words, prior to the shooting?
I believe prior to the shooting, originally we didn't know who the individual was, but at some point there was there was some radio traffic in which they did identify the suspect. I believe the business owners had gotten that information through an ID that he had, but I don't know how much I know some was passed on to the officers, but a lot of this stuff we find out in detail. We have to go back through those reports and look at the exact cases that this suspect was involved in, because a lot of times when someone's booked for a specific charge, you don't really have all those details as to what they're engaged in. But there was some criminal history exchanged over the air. I just don't know the exact depth of what it was.
And that was prior to the shooting?
Correct.
And Carla, if I may, so there were 3 or 4 citizens involved in this shooting?
There were 3 citizens involved, and of the three involved, I believe, it looked like we had 2 individuals who shot, and there was a gun range instructor who didn't have a shot over the officer, so he did not fire. But we had 3 people interviewed. I believe 2 were shooters of the citizens, and 1 did not fire because of the issue with standing right above the officer when the officer had fell. And if you look at when you see the video, there were 2 shooters from the right side.
And how many of those rounds
3 total shooters? Okay, I'm sorry, there were 3 total shooters.
3 total shooters. How many rounds did the citizens fire?
If you don't know, don't answer it. Yeah, when I was at the scene, I know all 3 fired. I don't have the exact count on how many exact rounds they had fired. And some of the issues were they don't have protocols on how to load how many rounds are in their magazines or weapon countdowns, so we don't have that exact amount.
And how many of your officers' rounds hit Mr. Payton?
I don't have that answer yet either.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.